Welcome to Friends Online. Today, we're going to do things differently because we got to talk. So Russia's at war with Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine. And I was studying for this message for Friends Online, and I was studying out of Joshua chapter 6. And if you've read that book of the Bible, when you get to chapter 6, you'll see that God commands his people to invade another people group. So you can imagine how uncomfortable I became. And to be honest, I didn't quite know how to answer it. So today what we're going to do is we're going to peek in on a conversation that discusses this very question. So Aaron Ophaug has a podcast called The Resilient Christian. And what they do is they have really authentic conversation around tough issues like this. Because he's seen people that have just recently come to faith fall away from their faith because of things like this, because of difficulties in the Bible like this. And we've also seen a lot of people that have been Christians for a long time start to deconstruct their faith because of tough issues like this. So Aaron reached out to a Old Testament professor of biblical studies who his area of study is on violence in the Old Testament. And they bring up this very subject. And so what we're going to do for this episode of Friends Online is we're going to peek into their conversation. And we're going to watch about 25 minutes of a 40-minute conversation. And if you stick with me to the end, I'm going to pop back in and give you a couple more resources if you want to continue diving into this question. So let's listen in.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Resilient Christian Podcast. I'm Aaron, your host, and thank you again for listening and watching and being part of our discussion. Today we get to jump into a topic that is really difficult but really important. In the Old Testament, in Joshua chapter 6, God tells Israel, commands Joshua to go into the land, their promised land, and to really annihilate and take out all of the other nations. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 21, it's a summary of this moment. It says this: they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. This is a very difficult passage because in it, the God that we love tells Israel to go and annihilate, basically genocide, all of these people in this area, in this region. And as we look at the Bible, sometimes we're uncomfortable. We don't know how to make sense of it. And so today we've invited Dr. Blair Wilgus, professor of biblical studies at Hope International, to join us on the show to help us give us a broad sense of how to make a good interpretation of these passages. And so Blair, thank you for joining us on the show. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to be with us on our show.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm thrilled to be here.
So we look at this passage and there's this word called harem. And my Hebrew's not that great. This is your field. But this word harem is this kind of description of annihilation of the Canaanites and the other people that Joshua had to go conquer. For many Christians and non-Christians, when they read this passage, it's difficult, it's confusing, especially with who we know God to be and his character. Can you give us kind of the broad strokes of how to interpret and make sense of these passages of war in the Old Testament?
Sure. Let me step back a little bit and just talk about how, because this is a big discussion, as you mentioned, real difficult to wrestle with, and there's a lot of different approaches. It's not here's the answer. I wish I could say here's the answer, but let me tell you a little bit about how some people approach it, and then we can kind of focus in on those harem passages. If I make maybe a key distinction, when we're talking about God and war, the conquest with Joshua, that's kind of a sub-discussion of a broader topic of the violence of God. God commands war in the Old Testament, but these kind of texts would include, God killing the earth in the flood, commanding Abraham to offer or sacrifice his son Isaac, death of the firstborn in Egypt, the status of women, the practice of slavery. All of these issues of violence in the Bible is kind of the big broader discussion of which the conquest is part. These discussions, if I can oversimplify them into two different approaches, a lot of people, or maybe half the discussion is about trying to defend God, and they tried to explain how this violence was necessary, or that it arose out of God's holiness. They try and draw attention to human sinfulness, the depravity of the people that God is killing, or the benefits that come as a result of God's violence. So that's kind of one side of the discussion. And then the other side of the discussion are those that question or critique divine violence. And this approach tries to recognize the human component of Scripture, recognize that the Bible does not always accurately depict God. They use kind of this non-violent Jesus as a ruler by which they measure or evaluate other pictures of God. So we've got these two, in the attempt to defend or agree with the violence that we see in the Bible, and the attempt to critique or question it. And so that same kind of spectrum then applies just to this issue of Joshua and the conquest. It's probably worth pointing out, anyone that talks about this, everyone, at least to my knowledge, that talks about this will state right up front, God's practice, God's command in the Old Testament is not warrant for believers to do so today. And that Christians are not to use military force to convert others to the gospel. So just get that right out of the way. We're still left with a God in, especially the Old Testament, but in places in the New, that uses violence. And how do we wrestle with this? And so if I can give kind of two, again, contrasting pictures, Tremper Longman, who was formerly from Westmont in Santa Barbara, he says there's spiritual continuity between the Testaments. So in the Old Testament, it is God that fights. God fights Israel's enemies. God at times fights Israel itself. There's the belief that God will fight, will come back and fight when the need arises again. But God did literally engage in Israel's military conflicts. And then in the New Testament, there's some continuity there, but it's a slight discontinuity as well. In the New Testament, Jesus fights spiritual powers and authorities, and Jesus will come back to fight in the final battle. So there's continuity in this image of God as warrior, but discontinuity in how that warfare takes place. Then on the other end of the spectrum, C.S. Cowles talks about a radical discontinuity. He says that the Old Testament is Christian scripture, but it's not by itself a Christian message. So he almost decanonizes the Old Testament. He contrasts this idea of God as a warrior in the Old Testament with the idea of a loving God that we see in the New Testament, and says that the New Testament's radically opposed to that image of God. He uses this Christological hermeneutic. God is interpreted by Jesus, and the New Testament picture of Jesus shows us that Israel misunderstood or misinterpreted God. And so we should base our image based on that peaceful, loving example of Christ. It's a big spectrum. There's lots of places in between, nuances, numerous different types, points of conversation, but that kind of gives us a range of the options that are out there.
Let's get into the Joshua passage, and can you walk us through some of the key elements and issues in interpreting God's command to Israel to conquer the Canaanites? How do we make sense of those specific passages?
Sure. Well, you already mentioned harem. That's the Hebrew word, and you offered two translations for it. You used the word annihilate, and as you read the passage, it said dedicated or devoted to the Lord. There's a number of different translations, but when you read in these battles in the Old Testament, stories where Israel completely destroys or devotes to God, those are different translations of harem. And that's a very difficult word to translate, and it's a very big concept to describe. So let me try and kind of summarize that. This harem is the consecration of something or someone as an offering to God. So in war, if we divide the spoils of war into three categories, so the riches, if they conquer and take over a temple or a palace, there's gold, silver, bronze. Those things are devoted to God by being picked up and placed in Israel's tabernacle or temple. If they encounter people, they are completely killed. They're killed, burnt. City non-living objects, buildings are destroyed. These things are not for human use. So treasures are for God's use. Humans can't take, Israel can't take the humans as slaves or as wives, and the buildings aren't to be lived in. Everything is completely devoted, destroyed, given up to God. This idea, the connection between the spoils of war and devotion to God had initially prompted some people to talk about holy war. Israel is engaging in holy war. And a number of scholars, I think, have helpfully distinguished our kind of concept of holy war with what Israel did. Israel's war is not in itself holy. Israel, as a people, had to consecrate themselves in order to go into war. But the nature of Israel's battle was, I think, better called Yahweh war, because in these battles, Yahweh was the one that fought. So this was Yahweh's battle, and these were Yahweh's possessions, if you will.
As I think about Exodus 15:3, I think it says, "I'm the Lord your God, the God who fights for you." And that sounds like that this is God's kind of battle. That's a really good summary.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Now, interestingly, there are different texts give different reasons for the harem. So Deuteronomy 20 is kind of Israel's manual of battle. What does a battle look like? How do you go about it? And the reason given in Deuteronomy 20 for the harem is that if Israel doesn't kill everyone that lives in the land, then those people will teach Israel to worship other gods. In Joshua 6, when they're about to go in, the reason given there is that these objects are consecrated to Yahweh for Yahweh's possession and use. These are a gift. In Genesis 15, this is in the first covenant with Abram. God says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back because the people of the land, their sin of the people of the land is not great enough. So there's the idea that Israel is acting as God's punishment. Let's see. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. There's the preventing Israel from being tempted, the need to carry out punishment, the devotion to God. But I think it's also important to point out that harem was not unique to Israel.
Yeah.
So the Moabite Meshasteli, which is it was discovered in now my memory's fading. It's from the 9th century, so it's about 400 years after the conquest. But we have the same term, the same kind of language used, where the god of Moab, Chemosh, spoke to the king, "Go take Nebo from Israel." I went, fought against it, I took it, and I totally destroyed it. That harem there. So this concept of harem is not unique to Israel, and it seems like we can talk about this as their cultural way of talking about war. I think that that's an appropriate understanding. That this is the way war was talked about in the ancient Near East.
So the way that they made sense of doing war was through this filter of harem, and other cultures would seek to do harem on other cultures as well when they would take over other land, and this was common. This was a normal thing, you think?
Well, there's only one. The Mesha stone is the Moabite stone is the only instance that we have found so far of this.
Gotcha.
So I don't know that I would say it's common, but we have at least one instance, which I think would testify to the fact that it was not unique. I think that's a fair appraisal.
How, as Christians who are listening, how do we make sense of God asking his people to do these things? It makes sense that he's fighting that battle and that's his. I think the tension that we are all feeling is, especially in light of the current conflict and war in Europe, so how do we kind of meld these two together between what we see, in the New Testament and the Old Testament, kind of what the continuity perspective. Sure. Are we to kind of just lean in that direction, or do we find middle ground? How do we make sense of this God who does that?
Sure. Well, let me, if I'm laying my cards on the table, I would fall more into Cal's category of a discontinuity.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a little bit more complex than that. So if we're talking about the conquest, there's actually two versions of the conquest in Joshua. Yeah. In chapters 1 through 12, Joshua and Israel took the entire land. They took everything. Chapter 11 is very clear. This happened in Joshua's life. God gave them everything. They didn't make peace with anyone. They owned the land.
Yeah.
And then in the second half of the book, chapter 13 to 24, there's a different version of the conquest. It took a long time. It's not finished at the end of Joshua's life. His final speech recognizes that not everyone was driven out. The entire book of Judges is predicated on the fact that Israel hadn't conquered the land. So we've got half of the book that said they had, half the book that says they haven't. And Judges is the follow-up to this long conquest.
Yeah.
And I think that the archaeological record kind of fits with that second version of Joshua. There's very little widespread destruction.
Yep.
And this indicates that Israel dispossessed. They pushed out the indigenous people rather than completely destroying them.
Yeah.
So they took over the promised land, but there's a difference between what we think of as a historical account and what Israel talks about in what we call their historical books, which are probably more accurately described as using historical events for a moral purpose. So if we draw this together, talking about the harem and what we can see in the actual text of Joshua and Judges in the archaeological record, I think we could say that in addition, Israel never carried out the harem.
Harem was never done. Yeah.
Right. Now, they talked as if it was in certain texts, but the reality is they never actually did it. And this was a cultural term. So I think we can say, in addition to them never actually doing it, I think the story that God told them to do it was more a cultural artifact than an account that it actually happened. So essentially, I would say that God didn't tell them to kill all the Canaanites. This is the way that they talked about going to war. We go to the war, and we have Christians on both sides of the army, on different armies. They're both praying to God. Everyone in the ancient Near East talked to their God, believed their God was fighting for them, and this idea of harem was a cultural artifact. I think that we can say God didn't kill them. That was a cultural way of talking about going to war, and they didn't do it as well. But the very important thing is not to say God didn't say it, Israel didn't do it, this text is useless. What we're doing with a cultural memory, what Israel does with this as a cultural memory, is they're using some kind of historical event. So everyone would say, I think, that something happened. There was an exodus, there was some kind of a conquest, but they're using some kind of historical event to tell a moral story. And those lessons that Israel's telling are what's important. So rather than focus on God as a warrior historical story about killing the Canaanites, what we need to do is look at what those texts are actually about. And so then we start looking at, this idea of fulfillment of promise. Joshua's 24 chapters, the first 11 are about the battle, but really there's only 3 battle accounts that are described. Most of them are just summarized very briefly. The detail in the book of Joshua is about what tribe gets to live in what land. It's the most important part of the book, or the most boring part of the book. Here's the cities that you get. Here's the cities that you get. Why is that important? Because God promised land and delivered. God is faithful to promises.
That makes sense.